Liam and Emily Harper seemed like the perfect young parents, living in a quiet Ohio suburb with their 2-month-old baby boy. But behind closed doors, their home hid a dark and horrifying secret that would shock the entire community and end in a tragedy no one could have imagined. In a quiet Ohio suburb, the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, mailboxes that matched the houses, and the occasional bicycle lying in a driveway. The neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew each other, asked names, and exchanged friendly greetings when they passed. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their children play outside, where neighbors looked out for one another, and where life seemed predictable and ordinary. Yet behind one unassuming front door, the life of a young family was far from ordinary, and a storm was quietly brewing. The couple living in the modest house had recently welcomed their first child, a baby boy who was just 2 months old. The arrival of the baby was supposed to bring joy and excitement, a new chapter in their lives filled with sleepless nights, gentle lullabies, and small, treasured milestones. The couple shared moments of laughter and tentative happiness, holding their son for hours on end, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes that seemed impossibly delicate. Friends and neighbors saw smiling parents, a small bundle of life cradled carefully in loving arms, and they assumed all was well. But beneath the surface there were cracks forming that no one outside the home could see. The stress of parenthood had begun to weigh heavily. Sleepless nights stretched endlessly, each feeding and diaper change blurring into the next. Frustrations that seemed small at first started to build. Every cry, every moment of inconsolable fussing, added pressure. In the quiet of the night, tensions that were never spoken aloud simmered and grew. The parents struggled to adjust, feeling increasingly isolated and overwhelmed. Friends who had once visited often had slowly stopped coming by, leaving the couple to face their growing anxiety alone. In the living room, baby toys were scattered across the floor, half-assembled, a silent testament to attempts at normal family life. A baby monitor sat on a shelf, but even technology could not ease the tension that had begun to permeate the house. Each day brought new challenges, and the parents found themselves arguing over small disagreements that had no resolution. In the eyes of the neighbors, they were still a happy, loving family, but inside the walls of the home, the pressure was mounting. The baby, too young to understand the world around him, experienced the household in his own way. He felt the stress, the frustration, and the uncertainty that had begun to infiltrate the family's daily life. Small accidents, minor injuries, or cries that went unanswered at times went unnoticed by outsiders, but added to a growing pattern that would soon have devastating consequences. While the community around them carried on with their daily routines, the quiet house held a tension that was invisible but real, a tension that would eventually erupt in tragedy. In those early weeks, the couple's lives were a mix of tender moments and overwhelming pressure. Each feeding, each diaper change, each sleepless hour piled onto the last, creating an invisible weight that neither of them knew how to bear. The outside world saw only smiles and occasional glimpses of normalcy, but inside, the atmosphere was fraught with stress, worry, and a growing sense of helplessness. The young parents were struggling to navigate the demands of caring for a fragile newborn, and the tension was slowly shaping the events that would soon shock the entire neighborhood and capture the attention of authorities. On a cold winter morning, the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of frantic shouting. Neighbors, accustomed to the usual hum of daily life, noticed an unusual commotion coming from the modest home on the corner. Emergency calls had been made, and within minutes, paramedics were racing down the street, their sirens piercing the still air. The sense of urgency was palpable, and a crowd of concerned neighbors gathered, unsure of what had happened, but instinctively drawn to the unfolding crisis. Inside the home, the scene was chaotic. The baby boy, barely 2 months old, was unresponsive in his crib. His tiny chest barely moved, and a pallor had spread across his delicate skin. Paramedics worked swiftly, performing resuscitation attempts with practiced efficiency, their faces calm but their movements urgent. Every second counted. The parents, in a state of panic, hovered nearby, their emotions raw and uncontrolled. Fear, desperation, and guilt mingled in their expressions, though to the paramedics, it was unclear whether this was simply the terror of any parent facing a medical emergency or something more troubling. The baby was rushed to the hospital, the ambulance weaving carefully through the neighborhood streets. In the emergency room, doctors and nurses immediately took over, placing the infant on life-saving equipment, monitoring his vitals, and attempting to stabilize him. Despite their tireless efforts, the situation quickly became dire. The child's body bore marks of trauma, bruises that did not match typical infant bumps, tiny cuts and abrasions in unusual places. These details did not go unnoticed by the medical team, whose training had taught them to recognize signs that suggested something more than an accident. When the inevitable announcement came, the room fell into a heavy silence. The baby boy was pronounced dead, his life cut tragically short before he had the chance to experience the world. Doctors, bound by their duty to protect children, immediately began documenting injuries and reporting the case to authorities. The combination of medical observations and unusual injuries raised immediate red flags. What had first appeared to be a sudden, unexplained tragedy now suggested the possibility of abuse or neglect. Police arrived at the home shortly after the emergency call, entering with caution and intent. They observed the parents' reactions, noting the mixture of grief and nervous tension, and began asking preliminary questions. The home itself became a scene of investigation. Items were photographed, the crib inspected, and the overall environment evaluated for hazards or signs of neglect. Every detail mattered, from the placement of toys to the condition of the infant's sleeping area. Investigators started to see patterns that could not be ignored: small injuries, signs of inconsistent care, and an atmosphere that suggested the child's well-being had not always been adequately protected. As the day unfolded, the neighborhood's perception of the home began to shift. What had seemed like a quiet, ordinary residence was now under scrutiny. Neighbors whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what might have gone wrong. Social media posts and phone calls from friends and relatives started to surface, painting a picture of a young family under pressure, struggling to cope. The combination of medical evidence, witness statements, and subtle clues in the home slowly formed a disturbing narrative. A situation that initially seemed like a tragic accident now hinted at a darker, more deliberate series of events. And investigators knew they were only beginning to uncover the truth behind the baby's untimely death. As the investigation continued, detectives began to uncover a complex and troubling picture of life inside the young family's home. At first glance, the house seemed ordinary: a modest living room with a worn couch, baby toys scattered across the floor, and signs of recent domestic life. But as officers examined the details more closely, patterns emerged that hinted at deeper issues. Previous reports from social services indicated concerns about the household. There had been whispered warnings from relatives, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances who noticed tense arguments, unusual behavior, and at times signs that the baby's care was inconsistent or inadequate. Phone records and text messages became a critical part of the investigation. Through careful analysis, detectives discovered exchanges that revealed the parents were frequently frustrated and overwhelmed. Messages hinted at unresolved tension, moments of anger, and a level of stress that neither parent seemed able to manage effectively. Social media posts painted a similar story. Pictures showed smiling faces and celebratory moments, but captions and comments suggested a deeper struggle. Friends expressed concern in comments that were later deleted. Messages that seemed small and trivial at the time, but which, when examined in the context of the investigation, became ominous indicators of a household in turmoil. Investigators also began to examine the baby's medical records. Pediatric visits had noted minor bruising, irritability, and unusual crying patterns, but at the time, they had been attributed to normal infant behavior. Yet in hindsight, patterns of repeated minor injuries, when combined with the parents' statements and the eventual fatal incident, suggested a dangerous environment. Each piece of evidence, seemingly small on its own, began to form a larger mosaic of neglect and potential abuse. Detectives noted inconsistencies in the parents' accounts, their timelines, and their explanations for minor injuries. These contradictions would later become key elements in building the case. Neighbors' testimonies also added depth to the investigation. Several individuals recalled hearing late-night arguments, objects being thrown, and occasional loud cries that seemed to come from the baby. Others remembered brief interactions where the parents appeared anxious, exhausted, and short-tempered. These first-hand accounts, combined with the digital evidence and medical history, revealed a household under intense pressure, where stress often escalated to conflict and where the baby's safety was, at times, compromised. The detectives painstakingly pieced together the sequence of events that led to the baby's death. They reconstructed the environment of the home, examined the layout, and noted the locations of injuries, which suggested not an accident, but repeated episodes of harm. Subtle details, such as marks on the crib, worn spots on flooring, and the positioning of baby items, all contributed to the growing understanding of what the infant had endured. Each discovery heightened the gravity of the case, revealing a web of secrecy, fear, and escalating risk that the child could not escape. By the time the investigation reached its midpoint, authorities had gathered enough evidence to understand the chilling reality. The death of the baby was not an isolated incident. It was the tragic culmination of ongoing neglect and abuse, hidden behind a facade of ordinary suburban life. The parents' struggles, once seen as the typical stress of new parenthood, had escalated into a series of choices and actions that ultimately ended in a devastating loss. What had started as an emergency call and a desperate attempt to save a life now evolved into a careful examination of culpability, setting the stage for the shocking revelations that would soon follow. The autopsy report arrived with findings that shocked even seasoned investigators. The baby boy's body revealed injuries far beyond what could be explained by typical accidents or normal infant behavior. Broken ribs in various stages of healing indicated repeated trauma over time. Bruises covered areas of his body that were rarely subject to accidental bumps, and small abrasions suggested forceful handling. The forensic pathologist concluded that the injuries were consistent with physical abuse, and some were inflicted in a deliberate and aggressive manner. Each detail of the report painted a picture of suffering that had gone unnoticed or ignored until it was tragically too late. Detectives confronted the parents with the findings, observing their reactions carefully. Each provided conflicting explanations, attempting to shift responsibility to the other or to suggest that the injuries had occurred accidentally. The contradictions only intensified suspicions, and investigators realized that piecing together the truth would require a meticulous examination of timelines, interactions, and behavior patterns. Every account was scrutinized for inconsistencies, every statement compared against physical evidence, and slowly a disturbing narrative began to emerge. The home, once a seemingly ordinary environment, became a critical scene of investigation. Officers returned multiple times, searching for clues about how the injuries occurred and what daily life had been like for the infant. Objects in the crib, furniture, and even flooring bore subtle traces that suggested moments of tension and possible harm. Investigators noted signs of repeated stress within the household, scuffed walls, displaced items, and evidence of hurried or careless handling of the child. These observations aligned with witness statements and digital evidence, gradually revealing a pattern of negligence and abuse. Community members began to grasp the severity of the situation as details were shared by law enforcement. Relatives, friends, and neighbors who had once expressed concern privately now came forward with accounts of moments they had witnessed but had dismissed at the time. Late-night arguments, sudden outbursts, and signs of a household under strain all contributed to a growing consensus that the baby ES environment had been unsafe. Each revelation deepened the horror, demonstrating how a life so fragile could endure repeated suffering in silence. Medical and forensic experts worked alongside investigators to establish the timing and nature of the injuries. Their findings indicated that the abuse was not a singular event, but occurred over a period of weeks, if not months. Some injuries had begun healing, suggesting that the child had survived previous episodes of trauma, each one unnoticed or explained away. The deliberate nature of certain injuries contrasted sharply with explanations of accidents, reinforcing the conclusion that this was a case of ongoing maltreatment. The conflicting stories told by the parents combined with the forensic evidence made the case increasingly clear to authorities. Both parents had opportunities to intervene, to seek help, or to prevent harm, yet each failure contributed to the baby's suffering. The narrative that emerged was harrowing. A vulnerable infant endured repeated trauma, and the adults tasked with protection either caused the harm or allowed it to continue. The shocking reality became undeniable. The child's death was the culmination of sustained abuse, and the evidence painted a vivid picture of cruelty, neglect, and devastating consequences that would soon form the basis of criminal charges. The case moved quickly from investigation to prosecution, drawing intense attention from the local community and the media. Courtrooms filled with neighbors, relatives, and reporters, all eager to witness justice for a life so abruptly and cruelly ended. The evidence against the parents was overwhelming. Forensic reports detailing repeated injuries, medical records showing patterns of neglect, and a collection of statements and digital communications that highlighted escalating tensions and warning signs. The narrative of a fragile infant suffering at the hands of those who were supposed to protect him was both undeniable and devastating. Prosecutors meticulously presented the case, detailing the injuries and the timeline of abuse. Each piece of evidence was carefully explained, connecting the patterns of trauma to the actions or inactions of the parents. Broken ribs, bruises, and untreated injuries were described not as accidental occurrences, but as repeated harm that indicated a dangerous and hostile environment. Witnesses recounted observations of a household under stress, moments of frustration, and interactions that revealed an inability or unwillingness to ensure the child's safety. The combination of forensic and testimonial evidence left little room for doubt. The courtroom atmosphere was tense as the parents faced the charges of murder, child endangerment, and neglect. Both displayed a mixture of emotions, from grief to defensiveness, as the prosecution laid out the details of the infant's suffering. Their conflicting accounts, which had initially hindered investigators, now served as further evidence of culpability. Attempts to assign blame to each other only reinforced the narrative of a household where responsibility had been repeatedly avoided and the baby ES safety consistently compromised. As the trial progressed, the community's shock deepened. Neighbors who had once admired the young family struggled to reconcile the smiling images of parents with a baby in their arms with the reality of the abuse that had occurred behind closed doors. Friends and relatives who had hoped for a typical young family's struggles now confronted the harrowing truth that the infant ES death had been preventable. The proceedings highlighted the fragile boundary between ordinary domestic stress and the potential for tragic outcomes when warning signs are ignored. The verdict was delivered after careful deliberation. Both parents were convicted on multiple counts, and the sentences reflected the severity of their actions and the ultimate cost, the loss of a defenseless life. For the court, the decision underscored the principle that the responsibility to protect the most vulnerable in society is paramount, and failure to meet that duty carries profound consequences. The families involved, though grieving and broken, found some measure of closure in the justice system's acknowledgement of the severity of the crime. In the aftermath, the case served as a sobering reminder to the community and beyond. Child protection agencies, social workers, and neighbors reflected on the signs that had been missed, the calls for help that went unheard, and the subtle indicators that sometimes signal danger in seemingly ordinary homes. The infant's short life became a catalyst for awareness, sparking conversations about the pressures of parenthood, the importance of vigilance, and the responsibility shared by a community to protect its youngest members. Though his life had been tragically brief, the baby boy left a lasting impact, a haunting testament to the consequences of neglect and abuse, and a call to prevent similar tragedies in the future.